Something is happening in the Middle East right now that most Western analysts are either completely missing or deliberately refusing to say out loud. A man who was internationally isolated just a few years ago, condemned, sanctioned, and shunned after one of the most brazen political assassinations in modern history, is quietly rewriting the rules of power across the entire Gulf region. Not with America's permission, not with the UAE's blessing, and without Israel at his side. Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, is building something entirely new, and the world is only beginning to understand the scale of what he is constructing, and what it means for the future of the Middle East, the global energy order, and the balance of power between nations that collectively represent nearly 500 million people, nuclear weapons, NATO membership, the world's second largest oil reserves, and control of the Suez Canal. This is not a story about diplomacy for its own sake. This is a story about a man who looked at the world in 2025, decided the old alliances were not protecting him, and began building new ones from scratch. Ones that leave the United Arab Emirates on the outside, keep Israel at arm's length, and reduce his dependence on Washington to a calculated minimum. If you want to understand where the Middle East is going for the next decade, you cannot look at the war in Iran and then look away. You have to follow MBS, because the shadows he is operating in right now are where the new world order is being drawn. Let's start with what shattered the old order, because to understand the alliance being built, you must first understand why the previous one broke down. For years, the conventional wisdom among foreign policy analysts was straightforward. Saudi Arabia and the UAE were two halves of the same Gulf power structure. They fought together in Yemen against the Houthis. They jointly embargoed Qatar in 2017 to pressure Doha into cutting ties with Iran and the Muslim Brotherhood. They both championed the maximum pressure campaign against Tehran. They both welcomed Israel's expanding strategic footprint in the region through the Abraham Accords. And Mohammed bin Salman, known to everyone as MBS, was in many ways mentored into his role by the UAE's President Mohammed bin Zayed, known as MBZ. The older, more experienced Emirati leader helped shape how the younger Saudi crown prince thought about modernization, foreign policy, and the projection of Gulf power. That relationship is over. Not strained, not paused. Over. The rupture started quietly, as the most consequential ruptures always do, in the form of competing interests that were papered over for years until they couldn't be anymore. The root cause, analysts at Foreign Affairs, the CSIS, and the Institute for National Security Studies all agree, is economic competition. Saudi Arabia's Vision 2030, MBS's grand project to transform the kingdom into a post-oil global hub for finance, tourism, technology, and artificial intelligence, requires attracting billions of dollars in foreign investment, international corporate headquarters, and global talent. For decades, the UAE, specifically Dubai and Abu Dhabi, held those titles. The UAE was the unquestioned economic powerhouse of the Gulf, estimated to be roughly 20 years ahead of Saudi Arabia in economic development. MBS looked at that reality and decided he was not going to accept it. Saudi Arabia began aggressively competing for the same investment flows, the same corporate relocations, the same events, and the same prestige that the UAE had built over decades. The friendliness between the two crowns began giving way to something colder and more calculating. As one MBS advisor posted publicly at the start of 2026, describing a structural imbalance between a large Saudi Arabia and smaller rivals, smaller Gulf states had been operating under the illusion that they are equal partners of the kingdom. That comment enraged the Emiratis, but it expressed out loud what MBS had been thinking privately for years. The break went public, violently, in Yemen. For years, Saudi Arabia and the UAE fought together in that devastating conflict against Houthi rebels. But beneath the surface, their proxy forces were increasingly backing different factions with different visions for Yemen's political future. The UAE had been steadily cultivating and arming a separatist movement called the Southern Transitional Council, a group that wanted to partition Yemen and carve out an autonomous southern state. Saudi Arabia backs the internationally recognized government, which insists on Yemen's territorial integrity. In December 2025, UAE-backed STC forces launched an offensive that pushed Saudi-backed government forces out of two major Yemeni provinces. Riyadh's response was startling. Saudi Arabia bombed an Emirati arms shipment at the southern Yemeni port of Al-Mukalla, destroying more than 80 vehicles and weapons that it said Abu Dhabi was delivering to the separatists. Riyadh then demanded that UAE troops leave Yemen within 24 hours. Abu Dhabi, humiliated, withdrew its remaining forces entirely. Think about what just happened. Two Gulf monarchies that had fought together for nearly a decade, that were considered partners in reshaping the Middle East, had just bombed each other's proxy assets and expelled each other from a shared war. Even at the absolute worst point of Gulf tensions during the Qatar blockade of 2017, Saudi Arabia had never directly attacked forces aligned with the UAE. This was not a disagreement. This was a declaration that the partnership was done, and that MBS was prepared to use hard power to enforce Riyadh's interests at the UAE's direct expense. The social media battlefield that followed told its own story. Saudi influencers and media outlets began openly calling the UAE Israel's Trojan horse in the Arab world, and denouncing the Abraham Accords that the UAE had signed with Israel in 2020 as a political military alliance dressed in the garb of religion. These are not words that leak accidentally. These are calibrated signals from a government-aligned media apparatus, a message being sent, loudly and publicly, about which direction Saudi Arabia is moving and which partnerships it now considers a liability. Abu Dhabi understands exactly what is happening. The INSS, one of Israel's most respected security think tanks, published a detailed analysis in February 2026 describing what they called a shift from quiet competition to open rivalry, a deep rift rooted in diverging threat perceptions, and a struggle for economic and regional primacy. The UAE has entrenched itself as Washington's most reliable Arab partner and, increasingly, as a close operational ally of Israel in regional security planning, intelligence sharing, air defense cooperation, military technology integration. The Israel-UAE-US axis has been hardening into something durable. MBS looked at that triangle and made a calculation. If the UAE is going to be the indispensable Arab partner in that structure, then Saudi Arabia cannot be locked into a subordinate position within it. Saudi Arabia is too large, too wealthy, too central to the Islamic world, and too strategically important to play second fiddle to a country 1/10 its geographic size. So MBS began moving in a completely different direction. And what he has built in that different direction is, depending on your analytical perspective, either the most important new security architecture in the modern Middle East, or the most dangerous. It began publicly on September 17th, 2025, at Al Yamama Palace in Riyadh. Mohammed bin Salman sat across from Pakistani Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, and the two of them signed a document that geopolitical analysts immediately recognized as something without precedent in the modern Gulf, the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, commonly known as the SMDA. The text of the agreement contained language that drew instant comparisons to NATO's founding principles, a collective defense clause stating that any aggression against one party would be treated as aggression against the other. Both countries are formally committed to militarily defend one another. A senior Saudi security official described the intent plainly as reported across international media. We hope this will reinforce our deterrence. Aggression against one is aggression against the other. The Pakistani defense minister, even more dramatically, initially suggested to journalists that what the agreement covered included Pakistan's nuclear capabilities, that what Pakistan has in its arsenal would be available under this pact. He later walked back that statement. But it had been made, and it was heard everywhere that mattered. Understand what Saudi Arabia just did. It signed the first ever mutual defense agreement between an Arab Gulf state and a nuclear power. Not a cooperation memorandum. Not a trade deal. A mutual defense pact. The kind of agreement that, if triggered, obligates one nuclear-armed nation to come to the military defense of another. The Institute for the Study of War noted this would likely concern Iran deeply, given Iran's history of hostile actions in both Pakistan and Saudi Arabia in past years. Iran's own president, Masoud Pezeshkian, tried to get ahead of it diplomatically by publicly welcoming the pact as the beginning of a comprehensive regional security system, in opposing Israeli military expansion. That framing tells you everything. Tehran understood the pact was implicitly directed at containing Israeli military assertiveness. As much as anything else, what drove Riyadh to this step? The Financial Times reported that Israel's September 2025 airstrikes in Doha, Qatar deeply unsettled Gulf states' sense of security, exacerbating long-standing concerns about American unpredictability and commitment to their defense. Saudi officials looked at what happened when Israeli operations struck targets that Gulf leaders had assumed were protected by the American security umbrella, and they concluded they could not rely on Washington alone. This is the crucial context the Western media largely missed. Saudi Arabia had not lost faith in America entirely. It was still pursuing a strategic defense agreement with the United States, still seeking F-35 jets, and still pledging nearly $1 trillion in U.S. investment during MBS's November 2025 visit to Washington. But Riyadh's strategic logic had shifted. The message from a senior Saudi security official who called the SMDA a formalization of strategic diversification amid regional turmoil is unmistakable. Saudi Arabia was building redundancy into its security architecture, because it no longer trusted any single patron, including Washington, to be reliably present when the missiles started flying. Then came the next piece: Turkey. The relationship between Mohammed bin Salman and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was, just a few years ago, one of open personal hostility and geopolitical confrontation. In October 2018, Saudi agents murdered journalist Jamal Khashoggi at the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Erdogan's government had surveillance recordings. They released them methodically. They used the killing to internationally isolate MBS at his most vulnerable moment. The two men despised each other. Turkey and Saudi Arabia were backing opposite sides in conflicts from Libya to Syria. Erdogan championed the Muslim Brotherhood, which MBS had once infamously called part of a triangle of evil. These were not superficial differences. These were deep ideological and personal rifts. And yet, in February 2026, Erdogan flew to Riyadh, walked through the gates of the Saudi royal palace, and sat down with MBS for 2 hours of direct talks. The joint statement that followed declared a new era of cooperation in bilateral relations, with agreements in trade, defense, and regional alignment. They jointly condemned Israel's strikes in Gaza and its recognition of Somaliland. They pledged to strengthen economic and defense ties. 8.5 years after MBS had cut diplomatic ties with Qatar over the Muslim Brotherhood dispute, MBS had also sat down with Qatari leader Tamim bin Hamad Al Thani and signed a series of defense, transportation, and investment deals. Bilateral trade between Saudi Arabia and Qatar had risen over 600% since the restoration of ties in 2021. Riyadh and Doha were aligning on Syria, on Gaza, on regional frameworks. The picture emerging is stark. The man who once called Turkey part of a triangle of evil was now hosting Erdogan for bilateral defense summits. The man who blockaded Qatar for 3.5 years over ideological disputes was now signing investment deals with Doha. And the man who was quietly expected to normalize relations with Israel and become the capstone of the Abraham Accords was instead telling every audience that Israel's conduct constituted genocide, and that normalization remained firmly conditioned on a clear and credible path to a sovereign Palestinian state, a condition that Israel's current government has made structurally impossible to meet. The geopolitical geometry of this is extraordinary. Saudi Arabia, simultaneously holding a strategic defense agreement with the United States, pledging nearly $1 trillion in U.S. investment, receiving American security guarantees including the promise of F-35 aircraft, and being designated a major non-NATO ally, is also building a parallel security architecture with Turkey, Pakistan, Qatar, and Egypt that is explicitly designed to operate independently of the Israel-UAE-US triangle. MBS is not choosing between America and independence. He's extracting maximum benefit from Washington, while building structural insurance that does not require Washington's permission to activate. The Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact, analysts at the Middle East Institute noted, is the first of its kind, binding the security destinies of an Arab Gulf state and a nuclear-armed South Asian power in formal treaty language. Pakistan brings to this arrangement a 650,000-strong active military, one of the largest armies in the world, missile capabilities, nuclear deterrence, and what analysts describe as strategic depth. Saudi Arabia brings financial resources on a scale that Pakistan desperately needs to stabilize its foreign exchange reserves and fund its economic survival. The economic dimension of the relationship is inseparable from the security one. Pakistan has received billions of dollars from Saudi Arabia to prevent its foreign reserves from collapsing. This is not charity. This is the economic architecture of a strategic dependency, one that Saudi Arabia can call upon when it needs Islamabad to answer. Then add Turkey to this equation. What Turkey contributes is qualitatively different from Pakistan and different from anything Saudi Arabia can build on its own. Turkey operates the second largest standing army within NATO. It has a rapidly expanding domestic defense industry producing drones, armored vehicles, warships, and fighter aircraft. The Bayraktar TB2 drone alone changed the battlefield calculus in conflicts from Azerbaijan to Ukraine to Libya. Turkey controls the Bosphorus, the strategic choke point connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Turkey is a NATO member, which means that Ankara's participation in any security arrangement creates unavoidable questions for the Atlantic Alliance about divided loyalties and competing commitments. And crucially, Turkey has geopolitical reach that neither Saudi Arabia nor Pakistan can match individually. Turkish military bases operate in Qatar, in Somalia, and across Africa. Erdogan's framework for a so-called Middle East corridor, an economic connectivity project linking Asia, the Persian Gulf, and Europe, gives Turkey structural centrality in the emerging non-Western trade architecture. Pakistan's defense production minister confirmed publicly in early 2026 that a trilateral defense agreement between Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey was already in the pipeline after nearly a year of deliberation. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan confirmed that discussions were ongoing. Bloomberg reported in January 2026 that talks were at an advanced stage and a deal was considered very likely. Saudi Arabia's own state-affiliated newspaper Okaz described advanced talks to include Turkey and the Saudi-Pakistani strategic alliance that will create a new defensive reality in the Middle East. Multiple Arab analysts and Qatar's former prime minister publicly called for Egypt to be included in the framework as well, describing it as an urgent necessity. The Jerusalem Post, analyzing the emerging alliance structure from an Israeli security perspective, laid out the combined weight of what this bloc represents in raw terms. Egypt controls the Suez Canal, the other critical choke point of global maritime trade, through which approximately 12% of global shipping passes. Egypt's population of over 100 million makes it the most populous Arab nation and the largest Arab military. Pakistan has nuclear weapons and over 250 million people. Saudi Arabia holds the second largest proven oil reserves in the world, is the world's third largest oil producer, and is the guardian of Islam's holiest sites, Mecca and Medina, giving the kingdom unmatched religious legitimacy across the 1.8 billion Muslims globally. Turkey has a GDP exceeding $1 trillion, a defense industry that has become a major global exporter, and operational military experience across multiple active theaters. Together, these four nations represent nearly 500 million people, multiple nuclear warheads under Pakistani command, NATO's second largest army, and enough oil production capacity to reshape global energy markets at will. Analysts at The Conversation and Asia Times describe this emerging four-way alignment bluntly: Pakistan, Turkey, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia emerging as a new regional power bloc, not replacing existing relationships, not breaking from the US entirely, but creating an independent platform for collective security decision-making that operates on its own terms, outside the frameworks that Washington, Israel, and the UAE have built together. The foreign ministers of all four nations. That dual condemnation is the key to understanding MBS's strategic position and why it is so difficult for Washington to manage or contain. Saudi Arabia is not anti-American. It is not pro-Iranian. It is not joining any rival camp in the binary Cold War logic that American foreign policy often defaults to. What MBS is constructing is a position of maximum leverage, one where Saudi Arabia is too important to lose for any major power, too independent to be commanded by any single patron, and capable of activating multiple different alliance structures depending on which threat is most acute at any given moment. Saudi Arabia can work with Washington on nuclear deal negotiations with Iran. It can work with Moscow through OPEC Plus on oil production decisions. It can work with Beijing on investment, technology, and trade. It can work with Turkey, Pakistan, and Egypt on regional security without those partnerships requiring American endorsement. The Iran war that erupted on February 28, 2026, stress-tested this entire architecture under live fire. When Iranian drones and missiles began striking Saudi territory, 575 drone attacks, 42 ballistic missiles, and 7 cruise missiles documented by Saudi defense authorities in the first weeks of the war, the question of who actually showed up to help became viscerally real. The alliances MBS had constructed on paper now had to prove their worth in practice. The answer was complex and revealing. Pakistan, despite the Strategic Mutual Defense Agreement, did not send military forces to Saudi Arabia's direct aid during the Iranian strikes. The pact's language, while binding on paper, contains enough ambiguity about what constitutes triggering conditions that Islamabad was able to avoid direct military involvement while maintaining diplomatic support. This is a significant limitation that analysts have noted: the gap between what a treaty says and what partners will actually do when blood is drawn. But what did happen was equally significant. Pakistan emerged as one of the most active diplomatic mediators in the entire US-Iran war, arguably the most important non-Western mediator working to broker a ceasefire. Pakistan's officials were in Tehran and Washington and Riyadh, threading the diplomatic needle that no other single actor was positioned to thread. This is exactly the role Saudi Arabia needs Pakistan to play, not necessarily as a military force multiplier, but as a diplomatic bridge that keeps Saudi Arabia's interests represented at every table where decisions are being made. Turkey intercepted Iranian ballistic missiles using NATO systems in the first weeks of the conflict, according to CNBC, when strikes targeted areas near Incirlik Air Base. This forced Ankara to make a choice, and Turkey chose to activate its NATO missile defense infrastructure in ways that positioned it alongside the Gulf states against Iranian aggression, even as Erdogan maintained public criticism of both Israel and Iran. What this reveals about the Saudi-Turkey relationship is something subtle but important. Erdogan and MBS do not need to share identical interests. They do not need to agree on every issue. What they need, and what they have achieved, is a framework flexible enough to accommodate their different positions while creating measurable alignment on the outcomes that matter most to both of them. Turkey needs Saudi financial weight and regional legitimacy. Saudi Arabia needs Turkish military capacity and NATO connectivity. The relationship works because it is transactional rather than ideological. This is the most durable kind of alliance, one built on complementary needs rather than shared values that can evaporate when tested. Meanwhile, the geopolitical distance between MBS and the Israel-UAE axis was made explicit by what did not happen when the war began. The UAE, which had developed deep defense and intelligence ties with Israel through the Abraham Accords, found itself in a position of extraordinary exposure when the conflict erupted. Abu Dhabi had bet heavily on Israeli security guarantees being backed by American power. What the UAE experienced instead was a Saudi Arabia that was not going to stand beside it. A regional environment in which being closely identified with Israel carried enormous costs in terms of credibility with Muslim majority nations, from Turkey to Pakistan to Egypt, and a war that destroyed the Iran Gulf rapprochement that China had brokered in 2023, the rapprochement that the UAE had also quietly benefited from. Saudi state media and Saudi-aligned commentators relentlessly drove a single narrative during the conflict, and in the months preceding it, that the UAE was acting as Israel's instrument in the Arab world, that Abu Dhabi's support for separatist movements in Yemen, Somalia, and Libya was fragmenting Arab state structures in ways that served Israeli and American strategic interests at Saudi expense. Whether or not this framing is entirely accurate is beside the point. The point is that it landed in Egypt, in Pakistan, and Turkey, among the populations and governments that MBS is courting as partners in the new architecture. Framing the UAE as subordinate to Israeli strategy is simultaneously a way to isolate Abu Dhabi and to position Saudi Arabia as the authentic, independent voice of Arab and Muslim interests. It is geopolitical narrative warfare, and MBS is winning it. What does all of this mean for Washington? The answer is uncomfortable. The Trump administration invested enormous diplomatic and economic capital into the Saudi relationship during 2025. Trump's May 2025 Riyadh visit produced defense and technology agreements worth at least $300 billion. MBS's November 2025 Washington visit produced pledges approaching $1 trillion in Saudi investment, a strategic defense agreement, major non-NATO ally status, the offer of F-35 jets, and agreements on civil nuclear cooperation and critical minerals. Trump received MBS with a White House ceremony including a flyover and cannon salute, the full ceremonial honors typically reserved for heads of state of America's closest allies. The symbolism was unmistakable. Riyadh's rehabilitation in Washington was complete. MBS had been transformed from an internationally pariah after the Khashoggi killing into America's most celebrated Arab partner. And yet, after all of that, after the $1 trillion pledges, the F-35 offers, the NATO ally designation, MBS still refused to normalize relations with Israel. He still refused to join the Abraham Accords. He still conditioned Saudi recognition of Israel on a two-state solution that Israel's current government has explicitly ruled out. He still hosted Erdogan, the most vocal Arab world critic of Israel. He still signed a mutual defense pact with Pakistan without seeking American permission. He is still building a security architecture with Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, and Qatar that gives Saudi Arabia structural options that do not require Washington's blessing to activate. As analysts at CSIS noted with pointed understatement after the November Washington summit, MBS got a lot from Trump. What did the United States get? The honest answer is considerably less than the ceremony suggested. There is one more dimension to this story that goes beyond the immediate alliance dynamics and into something far larger. The long-term question of what MBS is actually building Saudi Arabia to be. The Vision 2030 framework, the project to transform Saudi Arabia from an oil-dependent monarchy into a diversified, technology-driven, globally integrated economy, is the foundation beneath every foreign policy move MBS is making. NEOM, the futuristic megacity project on the Red Sea, has been scaled back from its original ambitions. Internal audits found evidence of deliberate manipulation by project managers. New NEOM contracts dried up in 2025. The project wasn't even mentioned in Saudi Arabia's pre-budget statement for 2026. This is a significant setback for MBS's modernization narrative. But it has not fundamentally changed the strategic direction. It has simply forced Riyadh to be more realistic about timelines and more pragmatic about which investments actually deliver returns. The energy price shock from the Iran war, paradoxically, has given MBS financial breathing room that he did not have 6 months ago. When oil prices spiked to $126 per barrel at their peak during the Strait of Hormuz crisis, the largest monthly price increase in oil market history, Saudi Arabia's petrodollar revenues surged. Every dollar increase in the oil price translates directly into hundreds of millions of additional state revenue annually for Riyadh. The war that damaged Saudi infrastructure also padded Saudi coffers in ways that give MBS more resources to fund his Vision 2030 investments, his regional diplomacy, and his defense buildup than he had when oil was trading in the $70 range that preceded the conflict. The strategic patience embedded in what MBS is doing is remarkable. He is simultaneously taking American money, pledging American investment, receiving American military equipment, and building independent alliances that reduce his dependence on American decisions. He is simultaneously condemning Iranian attacks on Saudi soil and refusing to permanently align against Iran in ways that would make future diplomacy impossible. He is simultaneously being declared a major non-NATO ally by Washington and partnering with Turkey, a NATO member, in a security framework that operates outside American command. He is simultaneously allowing American financial and military relationships to deepen and positioning Saudi Arabia to be the indispensable mediator and power broker in any future regional settlement, with or without American centrality. What Mohammed bin Salman is doing, strip away all the complexity, is this. He is ensuring that Saudi Arabia cannot be taken for granted by anyone. Not by Washington, not by the UAE, not by Israel, not by Iran, not by China, not by Russia. Every major power on earth needs Saudi Arabia in some form, for oil, for investment capital, for Islamic legitimacy, for Red Sea access, for diplomatic access to the Muslim world's most sacred geography. MBS is monetizing that indispensability into a position of permanent leverage. The new alliance forming in the shadows, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Pakistan, Egypt, with Qatar orbiting closely, is not a bloc in the traditional Cold War sense. It is a platform that can expand or contract, engage or disengage, apply pressure or offer accommodation, depending on what Saudi Arabia's interests require at any given moment. This is not the Middle East of the last 30 years, where American power was the organizing principle and everyone else arranged themselves in relationship to Washington. This is a new Middle East, where multiple organizing frameworks compete simultaneously, where the nation with the oil, the holy sites, the investment capital, and the strategic patience to wait out every other actor has decided it no longer needs to choose a single patron. Mohammed bin Salman is 40 years old. He has potentially 50 more years to shape Saudi Arabia's trajectory. The alliances forming in the shadows today are not tactical arrangements for the current crisis. They are structural reconfigurations of the regional order, ones that will outlast this war, outlast current administrations, outlast current disputes. The question is not whether a new alliance is forming. It already has. The question is whether the rest of the world will understand what it is and what it means before it has already remade everything they thought they knew about the Gulf.